Hey everybody, this is Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a quick impressions video of the new Anbernic RG405. Now this device just showed up on my doorstep earlier this afternoon, and so in this video here we're not going to be able to do an in-depth review. Those usually take me about a week to put everything together, and so instead we're going to focus here on the things that I can make an immediate judgment about. At the very least, I think I'll be able to give you a good idea of what to expect, at least initially. But there are quite a few unknowns. For example, as of making this video, I'm not really sure when this is going to actually release, but I would consider it to be in the next week or two. But I was able to confirm that the pricing is going to be around $175 plus shipping. And here's a look at the device itself. It has a metal shell, much like the other M models that Anbernic has already released. Okay, and first impressions here, number one is the screen size. This is a 4:3 aspect ratio, but a 4-inch display. And as you'll see here in a minute, that half-inch does make quite a big difference in screen size. Second impression here is the color. This is the gray model here, but as you can see, it has a bit of a greenish tint to it. I really like it. The other color that they're offering is a black or a very dark gray model. And finally, third impression here is that it has a more rounded shape to it than a lot of their other devices. And while it's a subtle difference, it does feel quite a bit more comfortable to hold in the hand. Additionally, it feels like it's more rounded along the back panel as well. And to me, this is a nice improvement. The other Anbernic devices had a little bit of roundedness to them, but were quite blocky. Also, by virtue of having a larger screen, the device is a bit taller too. And for me, what that means is that I have plenty of room for all four of my fingers here on the back. And so, in terms of initial shape and size, I'm a fan. Before we move on, let's go ahead and do some size comparisons. Here's the RG505. This one has a 5-inch screen with a 16:9 aspect ratio with the exact same chip inside. And so it's almost like these two devices are actually direct competitors. Now the RG505 wasn't a terrible device, but I felt like it lacked a lot of refinement. And between the two right here, when it comes to the initial appearance impressions, then I definitely like the 405 better. To me, it just looks way more compact, but then also it's quite a bit smaller too. Now the direct competition between the RG505 and now the RG405 is the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. This one also has the same chipset inside, and like with the RG505, retails for about $150. And when in direct comparison of the two, at least in terms of appearance, you can see right here that the 405M still looks a lot more compact than the other. Not only is the 405 smaller, but many of the components are larger. So the face buttons and the analog sticks are larger, and then same thing with the D-pad as well. And so again, I really like how compact looking the 405M is. In fact, it reminds me the most of another metal Anbernic device. This one here is the RG353M. Now this one has a much less powerful chipset inside and a smaller screen. This one is only 3.5 inches. But just like with the 405M, one of my favorite components about it is how compact it is altogether. And so it almost feels like the 405M is the slightly larger brother of the 353M here. To better compare how compact these two Anbernic devices are, let's compare them against the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. This one, like the 353M, is a 3.5-inch screen, but the interesting thing here is it's not that much smaller than the 405M. And so if you've ever used a Retroid Pocket 2 Plus and you felt like it was a very good size for you, then the 405M is not that far off. And as an added bonus, you will have more power performance compared to the 2 Plus, and then also a larger screen. One last comparison here is the Steam Deck. Now obviously this one's going to be much smaller, but for me I'm always on the hunt for a nice small device to be a companion to the Steam Deck. And I think this combination right here actually makes a lot of sense. The Steam Deck obviously will be able to play anything, including PC games, but then with the 405M, you can just have it tailored and focused to more retro games, things that work best with a 4:3 aspect ratio display. Now there are a lot of other small devices that could be a good companion to the Steam Deck, so my point here really is just that the 405M can also be one as well. Moving on to weight, so this is going to be 260 grams altogether. That makes it a little bit lighter than the RG505, but then also a little bit heavier than the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, and then down the line as well, the 353M and the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus are all lighter than this one. Another thing that really strikes me about the 405M is just how nice and thin it is. As you can see here, it's about 13.5 millimeters altogether at the thinnest part. As a direct comparison here, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus is a very thin device and only about a millimeter thinner. Now where it gets interesting is when you look at the thickest part. So here with the analog stick and the rubber bumps on the back, we're getting about 18 millimeters for the 405M. That makes it about a millimeter thinner than the RG505 at its thickest point. But what's surprising here is that it's nearly 3 millimeters thinner than the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus at its thickest. And that's due to the protruding stacked trigger buttons that they have on the 3 Plus. It's a similar story on the 2 Plus, but exacerbated more by the fact that the analog stick sticks out quite a bit. In the end, what this means to me is that the RG405M is quite pocketable as a device. Yes, it's a little bit larger overall than the 3.5-inch devices like the RG353M, but all the same, it retains that thinness, which makes it quite pocketable. Overall, I would say this is a device that you can definitely just kind of grab and take around with you around town. It's about the same weight as a modern smartphone and maybe a little bit thicker, and so if you're good with putting a phone in your pocket, you're going to be good with the 405M being in your pocket as well. And so here, at least with my initial impressions, one of my favorite things about the 405M is its overall size. It feels nice and compact, but then also thin and very deliberately designed. The fact that it is nice and small means that all of the buttons are very easy to access, and no matter what kind of button combination I want to press here, it doesn't feel like I'm having to stretch more than I would need to. And so from the perspective of just kind of holding the device and maybe carrying it around, it feels very comfortable. I'm a big fan so far of the design. Now earlier I mentioned the 1/2 inch does make quite a big difference when it comes to screen size between the 3.5-inch device and this one here. And as you can see here, between the 353M and the 405M, it is quite a big difference. Now obviously the 353M is a smaller device, but all the same, I feel like I'm getting more screen without also having this huge requisite kind of increase in size as well. And so specifically when we're talking about size and screen, if you've ever felt like a 3.5-inch device is just a little bit too small, but you don't really want a larger device, then I feel like the 405M is a pretty good compromise in that regard. It's not that much bigger, but the screen size here is quite a bit more impressive. Now the resolution on both of these screens are the same. It's a 480p display. And I'm not going to do a whole deep dive into the display in this video here. I'm going to save that for my in-depth review that I'll do here later in a week or two. And in that video, I'll do a bunch of other comparisons between other devices and then also look at things like color balance and overall brightness and stuff like that. But at least in terms of my initial impressions, I do like the overall size here. I think that 4 inches is a nice upgrade over 3.5. Okay, let's talk about buttons next. We're going to start with the analog stick because this one is the first time since the original RG350 where the analog stick is above the D-pad. Now the stick itself is a magnetic hall sensor stick, the same one that you can find in the RG353M. They have a nice gritty texture around the edge which makes it very grippy for your thumb, and so I really like this cap here. Now as far as placement, I do think it's weird that the analog stick is up top, especially for this device here. With a 4:3 aspect ratio display and the chipset that they're using, it's still going to be a very good device for retro gaming, which usually relies on a D-pad. And so it is a little bit odd that they're using an analog stick focused design on a device that's probably going to be used with the D-pad the most. Anyway, let's look at the D-pad next. Now this one is very similar to the other D-pads that you can find on Anbernic devices. But there does seem to be one thing that's a little bit different, at least in my initial impression. And that is, it feels like the face of the D-pad is a little bit thinner than the rest. It's almost like the edges have been rounded out a little bit more than usual. And the result here is that even though the plastic in the D-pad is quite hard, the softness of the edges here just feels a little bit more comfortable on the finger. Now in terms of everything else, like the travel and the pivot, this all feels the same as a typical Anbernic device. And honestly, I'm a big fan of the rubber membrane D-pads that they use on their devices. They have a nice classic and retro feel, a lot like an older Nintendo product. And also one benefit of having the D-pad below the analog stick is that the stick is not going to get in the way of your thumb at all as you're playing. Overall, I'm a little bit conflicted about this design choice. After all, I think that the 405M is probably a more D-pad centric device, but honestly, given the ergonomics and overall feel, it's not that much of a stretch either way. Moving on the bottom left here, we have a home and back button. And the way this works is by tapping on it, you'll get the back button, and a long press will give you the home one. And this button has a clicky micro switch feel to it. Over on the left side, we have the select and start buttons. These are slightly indented and also have a clicky feel to them. Next, we have the right analog stick, same feel as the left one here, so nothing remarkable. And then we have the face buttons, and these do have quite a bit of a change to them. First thing you may notice is that they have a glossy texture to them, much like how they are on the Anbernic RG35XX. And this is also the same kind of feel that you would get on other devices like the Mio Mini. Now it looks like the ABXY lettering is underneath the glossy coating, so I don't think it's going to rub off. And I will say that the glossy texture here gives it a much more grippy texture than their typical matte style buttons. And I've always been a big fan of their matte buttons, but I gotta say that I really like this glossy feel too. I think it may be because the original SNES D-pad had glossy buttons like this as well. Now in terms of feel, these are rubber membrane connections like the D-pad, so they have a retro classic feel to them. And the size and amount of travel and pressure here is very similar to other Anbernic devices. It feels very classic and nice. Okay, let's move over to the top and let's discuss the shoulder and trigger buttons. Now, much like with most other Anbernic devices, these are inline shoulders and triggers with a scissor switch kind of design. The buttons themselves have a very clicky micro switch feel to them, but one thing that did surprise me is that they feel quite small considering the size of the device itself. In fact, I think they're actually smaller than they are on the RG405M. Now, when it comes to practical use, given that this is a slightly smaller device, it's actually no problem here to either touch the shoulder and trigger buttons. It's definitely more of a reach to reach the L2 and R2 buttons, but again, it's not really that bad. And so while I usually do prefer to have stacked shoulder buttons like on the Retroid Pocket devices, given the size of this overall device and the ease of actually pressing the buttons, it's not a completely terrible setup overall. I would have preferred a different design, but I also see why they went this way in order to make it much more pocketable and thinner. Also up top on the left here, we have a ventilation for the heat, but bear in mind this is not an actively cooled device, so it's not going to be actually pushing air out of here. Next, we have an LED indicator when the device is charging, and then a USB port for data and power. It should be noted here this USB port is not capable of video out. Next to that, we have the volume buttons, also very clicky, and then finally the power button. And this one's also a little bit inset, so you're not going to be pressing it accidentally. And that's really about it for the top. We don't have anything on the sides either, so let's go ahead and focus on the bottom. To start, you can see we have two down-firing stereo speakers, and then we have a headphone jack. I like the fact that it's on the bottom here. I know some people like to have them on top so that they can rest the device on their chest, but that's never really been a thing for me. And then finally, we have a micro SD card slot, which is capable of both exFAT and FAT32 file formats. And then last but not least, let's take a look at the back. So we have two rubber pads, much like with other Anbernic devices. And then we have a single subdued logo here on the back, and then an indication here that we're working with a 4500 mAh battery. And really that's about it when it comes to my overall impressions of the design. It's a very premium feeling device thanks to the fact that it's made out of metal, and I think it's also very sleek, especially given the fact that it doesn't have a logo here on the front. And when it comes down to it, I thought I was going to hate the placement of the analog stick and D-pad, but because the device is so small, it's not really a stretch either way. And so I'd say after just a minute of holding this device, it didn't bother me at all. Okay, let's do a quick teardown. This is going to be using Torx T6 screws, and there's only 4 of them here on the back. I found it interesting that there's these little pads right here above the analog sticks. I think this may be there to hold them in place. It's also kind of neat that the battery is not attached to the back panel, so it's very easy to take this thing apart. So let's take a look at the PCB, and honestly, we don't get a lot of good insights here because everything is covered in the heatsink. The bigger one is covering up the battery, and then the one on the left here is going to be the CPU and RAM. But you can see here they do have the upgraded speakers from the 353M, and then we've got a single rumble motor here on the right. Anyway, here's a closer look. I'm not going to do a full teardown here, but it does look like the design seems to be well thought out and pretty clean. Alright, let's go ahead and power it up and get a feel for the overall operating system. Now this chipset is only capable of running Android, and so that's what you're going to be getting here, Android 12. When first booting it up, you'll get the option of choosing your language, either English or Chinese. After that, it'll do some configurations for the system. This will take maybe 2-3 minutes altogether. Anyway, once that's done, you'll be greeted with a typical Android interface, very similar to other Anbernic products. And like with other Android operating systems from Anbernic, it does come preloaded with a bunch of emulators. Many of these are going to be unnecessary, especially given the fact that this one actually comes with Google Play Store already installed. And so for me personally, I'm going to go through and delete all of these and actually install my own legitimately from the Play Store. Either way, it's very nice to see that the Play Store is on this device from day one. Another thing worth noting is that we have the over-the-air update app right here, so if you ever need to do a system update, this is what you're going to use. Now if we swipe down from the bottom, you can see there are some unique options that we have here. And this is also very similar to other Anbernic setups for other Android devices. On the far left, if you click on that Anbernic logo, it's actually going to start up their front end. We'll take a look at that here in a second. And then to the right of that, you have their key mapping software as well as their overclock and the ability to change the button layout from a Nintendo or an Xbox style. Now jumping over to their front end, we'll just take a quick look right here. And as you can see, they've gone through a design update since their last device launch, and it does look pretty sharp. And the idea here is that you could basically set up your emulator and your games, and then this would be your main interface if you wanted it. Now personally, I like to use an app called Daigisho. I've made an entire video about that. I'll leave it linked below. Additionally, I expect that the 405M will have an option to buy an SD card loaded with it, which means that if you wanted, it could come preloaded with games and you would use it with this interface. Either way, for me personally, I like to use my own setup, but if you wanted to use this front end, it is here and available. Now, I took a few minutes to set everything up off screen, but let's go over some stats real quick. To start, you can see here that it has 4 GB of RAM installed, and this is using the 8-core Unisoc Tiger T618 chipset. In terms of display, you can see here it has a resolution of 640 by 480. Moving over to network settings, you can see here it is set up for 5 GHz Wi-Fi. And then finally, yes, to confirm here, it is reporting a 4500 mAh battery. Let's go ahead and do a quick audio test right here to get a feel for those down-firing speakers. Overall, I think it sounds pretty good, just about the same as it is on the RG405M, which is fairly decent. I'm going to save a lot of the Android games for the in-depth review just because a lot of them are very large file sizes and I don't have the time to download them real quick before the impressions video needs to go live. At the very least, I was able to grab Horizon Chase Turbo from the Play Store, and yeah, it works out great. All the buttons were registered properly within the game as well. Now, moving over to emulation, there are a couple things I do want to show off here. To start, you can see the scaling is not going to be perfect at full screen on a 480p display like it is with the 3.5-inch devices. And of course, there's a couple different ways to fix this. We're going to go into RetroArch and then into the settings, and then we'll go into video. Now within scaling, you can go ahead and turn on integer scaling, and that's going to give you the highest integer scale with perfect pixels. But as you can see right here, it does give you some black bars around the edges. If you want to have perfect pixels and you don't mind having a smaller screen, then this is going to be your best bet. But there are some tricks that you can do to kind of get something very similar. For example, if we go back into the video settings and turn off the integer scale, we can go and make some filter changes. So we'll go and turn on bilinear filter, and then also under video filter, we're going to select normal 4x. And I've showed this off in many other videos, but essentially what this is going to do is smooth out those pixels while keeping them relatively sharp as well. It's not a perfect solution, it's not going to be quite as sharp as integer scaling, but I think on a smaller screen like this, it looks really nice. Now, if we had a higher resolution display, we could do larger factors of integer scaling and it would look even sharper. But as it stands right here with that normal 4x filter, most of the games you want to play from the 8 and 16-bit era are going to look really nice. Again, it's not going to be a perfectly crisp display like I have seen sharper like on the Anbernic RG552, but all the same, I think this works out really well when it comes to playing retro games, especially those that are tailor-made for a 4:3 aspect ratio. I also found that when playing D-pad centric games like this, having the D-pad on the bottom didn't bother me at all. Now you have to also bear in mind that I'm someone who's very familiar with playing with Xbox controllers, so it really isn't that big of a deal for me. So if you're somebody who really prefers to have the D-pad up top, it still may bother you, but at least for me, it was just fine. Now that being said, when playing an analog stick centric game like an arcade game, yeah, it felt really good to have the analog stick up top. So there's no doubt about it. I think when you're playing an analog-centric device, it just feels more natural than with the D-pad. But again, like I said a couple times already, it wasn't really that bad to use the D-pad on a lower position. In terms of D-pad accuracy, I found it to be pretty good. For example, when playing Street Fighter right here, anytime the E-Honda would get off my back and allow me to actually do a move, it usually did work out pretty well. However, to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of metal devices when it comes to D-pad-centric gameplay. I've always felt like pushing down on a rubber membrane D-pad into a metal shell just feels a little bit too hard. And so at least for me personally, I would have preferred to have this device be plastic over metal, but I think that's a personal preference. There's a lot of people out there who love that premium feel of the metal shell. So for me personally, yeah, the D-pad feels pretty accurate, but I don't really like using it in this regard when it comes to a metal shell. Now when it comes to emulated systems, I think the ones that are going to shine the most are going to be those that are harder to emulate but still have a native 4:3 aspect ratio. So I think this device is going to be really good for Nintendo 64 games, especially those that use an analog stick primarily. And then same thing with other systems like Sega Dreamcast and Sega Saturn. To top it off, these all have a native resolution of 480p as well. Obviously, you won't be able to see any sort of improvement when you do any upscaling, but it's still pretty awesome to be able to play these games at their native resolution and aspect ratio on a larger screen like this. And so in particular, if you are most excited about those systems, this device is going to be a very good fit. Now, PSP also runs really well on this device, but it is a little bit odd to have a 16:9 aspect ratio on a 4:3 display like this. It just gets a little bit more squished. All the same, you're going to be able to play just about every single PSP game at a 2x resolution, and it's going to play just great. So really, when it comes down to it, it's not a performance issue with any of these systems, it's really just finding that right aspect ratio. Now, when performance does get into play is when you get to those higher systems, things like GameCube and PS2. Now, I've tested this chipset extensively with these two systems, and so if you want to see some more in-depth coverage, I would recommend checking out my RG505 or Retroid Pocket 3 Plus reviews. But in a nutshell, I would say that you can probably play at least 25% of GameCube and PS2 games, but it is going to require some tweaks on your end as well. For example, I generally recommend that you use the PAL-ROM versions of these games, because many of them have the option to run at 50Hz, which is going to be a lot easier to reach full speed on. But even then, you'll probably have to stick to the more lightweight games in each of these catalogs. And I'll also do more testing when I do my in-depth review here in a week or two. Suffice to say, with the RG405M, the performance here is going to be just about the same as it is on the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, as well as the RG505. For me personally, I don't like to say that this device is capable of those two systems. Instead, what I like to say is that they're a nice added bonus for many games. It's going to be a similar story with Skyline, which is the Nintendo Switch emulator. This one will be able to play some lightweight games, but I wouldn't have high expectations here. Also bear in mind, because this is a 16:9 system, some of these games are going to look a little bit squished on this 4-inch display. Anyway, that's about it for my initial testing, so let's talk about some of my thoughts, at least in my first day with this device. And we'll talk about 3 things I like and then 3 things that I don't. To start, I like the overall size and thickness of this device. It feels very compact, and I also like that it has a 4-inch display on something that's so small. Honestly, it's not that much larger than the 3.5-inch display devices, but the screen size is quite a big difference. In particular, I think this device is going to be excellent when it comes to playing 4x3 content. In particular, this is going to be excellent for Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and Sega Saturn. Now, in terms of the 3 things that kind of put me off about this device, number 1 is the low resolution on this display. Now, I imagine that Anbernic had a very hard time finding a 4-inch display in the first place, because this is the first one I've ever seen on a device like this. And so they may not have had a lot of choice when it comes to the resolution. Regardless, if we had had a higher resolution, we could have done better upscaling with pixel games, and it would have just looked a lot sharper. Additionally, the chipset on here is definitely powerful enough to be able to upscale to 720p for a lot of those retro systems. And so I do feel like we are leaving a lot of performance on the table just by the fact that the resolution on the display can't really handle that. Another thing that was a little bit odd was that I didn't like the fact that this thing ran Android. Now, obviously, I understand that the T618 chipset is only capable of Android, but all the same, this just felt like a device that would have been better served with a Linux operating system. I do hope that the Rockchip RK3588 chipset will be coming to retro handhelds at some point in the future, and that chip is very exciting to me because it's very powerful, but then also Linux friendly. And so I guess I found myself wishing that the 405M with this form factor and screen also had that chipset inside. That would have made it much better when it comes to GameCube and PS2 gameplay. And finally, another thing that I noticed in my initial testing is that the device does get quite warm, especially on the right side underneath the face buttons. And that makes sense because that's the side of the device that has the CPU. Either way, it does get warm, not uncomfortably so, but I definitely did notice it. Anyway, in wrapping things up here, these are my initial impressions of the Anbernic RG405M. When it comes down to it, I feel like this device is the next evolutionary step from the RG505 that was released in November. If anything, it makes me feel like I wish this one had been released instead of the RG505 in the first place. In the end, this isn't really a huge upgrade from the 505, but it is a nice refinement. And really, I think the major competition for this device are the other T618 chipset devices that are already on the market. For example, if you already have a Retroid Pocket 3 Plus or an RG505, I don't really see this being a viable option for an upgrade, especially given the fact that the pricing on this is going to be about $175 altogether. But all the same, if you don't have one of those other devices, the 405M, at least in my initial impressions, does a lot of things right. But I'm going to leave my final judgments for that in-depth review, which will be coming here pretty soon. So let me know what things you'd like me to cover in that next review in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!